Hello and welcome to the pod. I'm Nathan Fink.
I'm Jasmine Torres Allen, and this is New Hampshire Family Now,
a show about building family in the Granite State. Today in the podcast, we're joined by co-host Jasmine Torres Allen, who learns us something new, and later Child Welfare Systems changemaker Dr. Aaliyah Frankmeyer discusses an unsystem in support of families everywhere. New Hampshire Family Now is brought to you by the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation. Since 1962, the Charitable Foundation has worked hand in hand with generous and visionary citizens to maximize the power of giving and support, collaborate, and lead innovative initiatives. Initiatives like New Hampshire Tomorrow, which is focused on making sure children and families have access to education, healthcare, and career pathways to ensure every family member thrives. To learn more about New Hampshire Charitable Foundation and all their initiatives, go to www.nhcf.org. This podcast was also brought to you by Family Support New Hampshire. Family Support New Hampshire is NH's coalition of family resource centers and family strengthening programs that exist to ensure Granite State families have access to resources so both caregivers and children can succeed, because supported families are strong families. To find a family resource center near you, visit www.fsnh.org. Hello and welcome to the podcast. Today I am beyond excited to introduce the new co-host of New Hampshire Family Now, Jasmine Torres Allen of NHPBS fame. And of course, Jasmine learned something. Jasmine, are you sure about this?
Yeah.
I'm so fascinated by your journey and how you got here. Because in my 30s, I started to understand certain things. I wish I had this mindset earlier, but I didn't.
All the time. I think about that to myself all the time. I was like, if I had had just one person who had said, you could do this for a living, you know what I mean? That's a possibility. Then I probably would have shifted a long time ago.
Right. And
I didn't have that chance. Instead, I was like, all right, I'm just going to do what my parents told me to do and take that track. And I did. And then when I get to a point where I was like, this is just not fulfilling for me. And then I was like, I gotta do something. I gotta make a jump. And I did. I jumped into the nonprofit world. And that's when I started doing real community work. And I was like, and I really enjoyed it. And so
you had me at Katrina in the Waves. I mean, I always think too, part of this is really solipsistic. It's always about the self, because I'm wondering honestly all the time, am I on the right path?
All the time.
Are we on the right path?
I ask that question. Even when I think I'm on the right path, I ask that question still.
And then that question becomes so moot because it doesn't matter what path you're on. It's do you care enough to observe where you're going in the midst of where you are?
The way I see it is what's my purpose right now? Because my purpose is going to change.
Right.
Priorities change every time. So what do I care about the most right now?
Right.
And that's what I'm going to put my full energy into.
And I think, with parents, I'm such a hard sell on having kids, which my friends must hate, because I look around, I'm like, you should have kids. Here's why. You should have kids. Here's why. And they're like,
see, I'm the complete opposite. I'm more of, you should have kids if you feel like you're mentally ready to have a kid.
I've never been mentally ready for anything.
I wasn't mentally ready to have kids either.
The reason why I'm such a hard sell on having kids is care about something other than yourself.
Right.
And when I started to care about something other than myself, I became impactful.
I'd have to agree with you on that, because if I look back, I had my daughter almost 6 years ago. And that was exactly when everything shifted for me in terms of what could I do better around me to make sure that her life is good and the kids around her. Because then you end up caring about the kids who go to school with her, you know what I mean? And the families that surround us. And then you start to think, you're right, you do start to think outside of yourself.
There's a total shift in that, because instead before I was lying to myself thinking I didn't need anybody. I could survive. But then when I added to that with a spouse and then children, it's not about can I, it's can we, can they. And that little shift said, well, no, not without community.
Right.
But anyway, we got to start this podcast. I'm so glad you're here. And I want to know, obviously, what are you working on in the family? What are you learning currently?
Okay. So something that I learned this week is, some parents don't know how to play with their kids. There's a lot of young parents who are like, I don't exactly know how to play with toys or have imagination and create scenarios scenarios. And so I was like, oh my gosh. And I thought about it for myself too. I was like, I know how to play with my kids, but I don't exactly know how to create like imaginary scenarios and things like that. And it was just something that I realized I was like, you have to tap into your inner like kid to be able to be in that mindset. And so I was looking into like the science of it all. And I learned that like play is the best way to decrease stress and anxiety in your kids, especially when they're having a tough moment.
So wait a minute. Now this means then that you realize, and I don't really think in right and wrong terms, but this means you realize you were doing it wrong.
Right. I would say when I was playing with my kids and, my daughter was like, let's play dolls and, let's play with the dolls together. And she was like trying to create a scenario, but she didn't really know how to. And then I thought to myself, I was like, okay, it's kind of hard to play. And I was like, oop, inner time. Like, you have to kind of go inside yourself and you're like, oh my gosh, did I play with dolls? Like, how did I play with dolls? And like, did I ever even get the chance to? And I had to go back and think in my memories. And it turns out there are other parents who don't know how to play with their kids either.
Did you kind of creep back then into your own childhood to say, wait a minute?
100%. And I realized I was like, my parents didn't really get a chance to play either. They had to grow up really fast. And my dad went to work as soon as he could. My mom, she was a teacher at a young age. So like, there wasn't a lot of playtime. And growing up, I had to think, I was like, I didn't have a lot of playtime, imaginary time when I thought about it. And I was like, there's some work to be done here. And, and I had to go kind of inside myself. And that's when I started doing the research of like understanding that, playing with your kids, especially you as a parent or as a caregiver, how important it is to play with them because it helps build those bonds with them.
Right.
If you can create and be imaginative with them alongside them, it's much easier for them to feel open with telling you things. It's much easier for them to explain to you that they might feel anxiety or worry about something. And sometimes you can figure out what your kids know through play. You know what I mean? You can watch them play out scenarios that they've had throughout their day or, language that they might have picked up that you're probably like, oh no, I should probably not say that. But play is so important because it helps them process their day.
Yeah.
Even as an adult, how do I process my day? You know what I mean? It kind of brought me back to like, what do I do to process my emotions when I have a tough day, when I have a, tough interaction? And I realized I was like, oh no, I'm not doing anything. And, and so it was one of those things where I was like, what do I do now?
Okay. So we learn how to play, which means we have to kind of unlearn the structures of our own adult governance of the world.
Right.
Like create structures, but don't make those structures so rigid
that they can't play within those structures, or when they feel like they want to leave those structures or question those structures, that they can. And so that's the thing about toys, right? You can do whatever you want with toys, but because we see that there's a structure, our brain automatically wants to play within that structure. And kids don't play within structure. When they don't color inside the lines. We teach them to be that way. It's one of those moments where you're like, I don't want to destroy their imagination just yet. I want them to keep asking questions.
That's right. This is, if my wife listens to this, she's going to say this is why she never reads instruction manuals.
Yeah.
But I think this is interesting because I had heard, and this is a while ago and poorly recalled, but that if you give a child a toy and give them no instruction, they will inevitably not only figure out how to use it, quote unquote, correctly, but they'll also return an exponential amount of ways to play with it.
Yes. And all the different ways that you probably would not have thought of how to use that toy. And I would say even then they might even break the toy. And so for us, we're like, oh no, they broke that toy. But in reality, like they were figuring things out. What do we do as adults when we figure things out? We fail, we break things, right? And we learn from that. And so that's the same thing with kids. And there's a lot of like breaking a lot of those barriers of, oh, they made the mistake of breaking the toy. All right, what do we do from here? Do we freak out? The inner you is like, I just bought that toy. It was a lot of money. And then you think they only see it as that toy. That's the other part you kind of have to approach and kind of break through too, is like, they might break the toy.
It's like the debris of learning.
Exactly. And as I think it's Neil deGrasse Tyson that he says, let your kids walk through the puddles so that they learn what it feels like to be wet, because that's how that's science that's happening right there. The cause and effect of something that when you do something through play, you learn cause and effect. You learn mistakes, you learn how to process your emotions in your day.
Well, I am so appreciative of you coming back. It's great to see you.
Oh, okay. Awesome.
And when we come back, we welcome Dr. Amelia Frankmeyer, founder and CEO of Aaliyah Innovations. Don't go anywhere. Many thanks to New Hampshire's Office of Social and Emotional Wellness for sponsoring this podcast. Started within New Hampshire's Department of Education, the Office of Social and Emotional Wellness consolidates policy development and implements projects and programs that are focused on health and wellness with an emphasis on behavioral health of all students, youth, and families. To learn more about the Department of Education and its many programs and approaches, visit www.education.nh.gov. Today's show was also brought to you by Burgoo Media, a full-service media company dedicated to helping nonprofits realize impact stories for print, video, social, and legacy media, and more. Both budget-conscious and grant-friendly, Burgoo Media helps your organization celebrate the humans in human services. Learn more at burgoomedia.com. And a quick note before we return to the show, mark your calendars because New Hampshire Gives is right around the corner. June 6th and 7th, Granite Staters turn out en masse to support the organizations that make New Hampshire such a wonderful place for our families. Visit NH Gives, where you can search for your local family resource center or other family support programs, or even New Hampshire Children's Trust. Because when we strengthen Granite State families, all of New Hampshire succeeds. Hello and welcome back to the podcast. I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Amelia Frankmeyer, speaker, author, child welfare systems changemaker, as well as CEO of Aaliyah Innovations. Dr. Frankmeyer, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Nathan.
Oh, and I forgot in that intro, I should mention fellow Midwesterner, which means at the end, it's going to take us about an hour to say goodbye. So
that's right. The long goodbye.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on the show. I'm a huge fan of your work in the sector. But for those who don't know about the work of Aaliyah, what is it you're working on and what drives it?
Well, thanks for those nice comments. So Aaliyah is a national nonprofit. We're based in St. Paul, Minnesota, and we work in about 30 different jurisdictions annually. And what we do is we help to equip and transform systems so that children can live safely with their families. And so we do that in ways by partnering with parents and working with folks who have been impacted by the system to co-design new ways of work alongside the system. What drives it really is our deep and abiding belief in what humans need to thrive, which is a sense of belonging and connection. And we really believe that when you have that, when you get wired for connection and have people to whom you belong, that really drives the rest of your life experience. And that kind of sits at the base of all other social ills that we are trying to solve. And so we just think it's fundamental to being a thriving human.
I've been doing a lot of reading and, your most recent blog that came out, and there's so much great information where you're talking about a system that encourages separation, which is just counter to everything you just said. What do you mean by that? What is a system of surveillance and how does it lead to separation?
Well, this is really goes back to the assumptions upon which the child welfare system was built. And the child welfare system was built on some cultural assumptions that poor children would fare better with wealthier families, and that Black, Brown, and Indigenous children would fare better with white families. And so there was really a beginning assumption that there were some people who could give some children and I'm air quoting this, better life. And that better life was really measured by wealth, opportunity, exposure, but was not measured and still isn't measured today in many courts by where they would be with people who look like them, who share their culture, who could give them a sense of belonging and connection, people to whom they are related and who love them. And so better was defined quite differently. And what we've learned through the research really is that it is better to sleep on your grandmother's floor than in a princess bed in a stranger's home. And so that definition, based on the evidence and the research and so much lived experience and practice wisdom, has taught us that those definitions were off, those assumptions were off. There's also something else at play here, which is really around the disproportionality in our country and sort of this idea of where does surveillance come from? So you may have heard the child welfare system called the family policing system, or you mentioned that I have talked about, and many, many others, of this idea of surveillance. And that has deep roots for us culturally as well. Black and brown and Native children are very disproportionately impacted and represented in our child welfare system in just about every measure. So they're called in more frequently. Their cases are substantiated for abuse and neglect more frequently. They stay longer. They have a less likelihood of being returned to their family. They have less access to mental health services, you name it. So there's an enormous amount of disproportionate impact on children and families and communities of color through child welfare. So this idea of policing and surveillance actually has historical roots in other places, and it's not really unique, frankly, to child welfare. Like you might know stories about other policing we've seen with Black, brown, and Native folks who they were supposed to be, and someone who felt thus empowered to take care of that and respond with a citizen's type arrest, or who might, make a call to the authorities. I was thinking in particular about, the African-American bird watcher in Central Park, and, a white woman called him in because she felt afraid, even though she was the one who had her dog off leash and he was just bird watching. So this is really ingrained in a lot of what we see in our society and has really historical roots back to the slave patrol. After slavery, white folks were kind of deputized as an extension of law enforcement to be able to watch, surveil, and report folks who weren't, quote unquote, where they were supposed to be, who could be returned back to slavery. And so this idea of mandated reportings, you are mandated to report that, you are surveilling, you are policing, is a structural vestige and artifact of our cultural history.
And New Hampshire is a mandatory reporting state. So can you kind of trace then this surveillance to separation and how that actually occurs?
Sure. So when you have an over surveillance, there is an over reporting. And when I was kind of growing up in social work, we were taught just report it. You report everything, because then the liability isn't mine. It becomes someone else's. And it's up to them to decide if there's abuse or neglect. But when we over report, we actually then invite investigation into families. So there's all this opportunity to see things that might not otherwise be seen. If someone knocks on your door and doesn't need to have a warrant and can come into your house and evaluate your parenting, the state of your home, what's in your refrigerator, your financials, how you're interacting with your kids, talk to your kids separate from you about how mean you are, because I'm sure you have those moments. If somebody was looking at every aspect of your life, you're just more likely to find something. In my life too, right? It's just that people aren't watching us at every moment. I often say, I teach trauma-informed parenting, and if you videoed everything that I do, and some of that ended up on the internet, I would probably lose my job at some point. I'm not a perfect parent, surprise, surprise. And my guess is nobody is. But if you have somebody watching your every move, you're just more likely to notice or note things that might be just frankly none of anybody's business. Or that if we surveilled everyone at that level, you too would have things that would be founded.
Yeah, we have this. I had a home visitor not too long ago, and there's this deep reaction into essentially getting my house in order so not to be under kind of the watchful eye of a person who is really coming into the house to help me sort out some challenges. But our system, and you've recently written about this, our system, the resources, the roles, and the rules, right? They're all kind of then aligned, though, to be kind of counter change and keep things exactly where they are.
Yeah, there's so much to say about that, about all, when systems kind of mature as child welfare is, everything, the rules, the roles, the funding line up to keep it the way it is. So if you think about things like, we're all about child and family well-being, well, whose job is that? Almost nobody's job in the system. Okay, and what funding stream supports child and family well-being? Zero. our funding streams are built on the beginning assumptions, which is the rescue and removal of children. And so almost all funding is available after a child's been separated or removed. I mean, the Family First Prevention Service Act has some initial funding. It's very limited. It has to be really aligned with evidence-based practices that don't largely have roots in child welfare. And so, there is some movement in that way. But by and large, the big dollars, the billions and billions we spend are accessible upon separation or at risk of separation. It's not really to support families, to reinvest in families, to reunify families. It's largely available in the other. And when you think about our roles, I mean, I often go to systems where, we say the most important thing is helping parents to safely parent. And then I say, okay, now whose job is that? And I might get one or two hands in a whole system. And they say, I work with 25 or 40 parents at a time for 6 weeks. And I think, oh my goodness, this is a years long effort. You don't undo years of intergenerational trauma, generations of trauma in a 6 week or 8 week or 3 month even intervention. And so we just don't have the funding, the rules, and the resources to support keeping families together. It's really linked up towards surveilling, making an assessment or judgment, separating, and then I like to call coming into care like the Hotel California. You can check in, but you can never leave. Right. Everything about it is about services and keeping you in, not in helping you to leave.
So you have to gain this hand up, what you have to do then is enter the doorway, but the doorway is on the precipice of either crisis or something like that. So by the time you enter, we're in the wrong starting spot to begin with.
Well, I think that's probably true for white families. And then for families and children of color, when you consider that 1 in 2 Black children is investigated by CPS before they turn 18, I don't believe that 50% of Black children are in crisis or Black families are in crisis. It is our bias at the front door that says that things are not like we might want them to be, or they're judged by different factors. And the bias comes into play, which ends up in bringing more Black and brown children into the system than are in crisis.
Now, you had talked about the funding disparities. Is there kind of a ratio that we can point to where X amount of our spending goes here as opposed to where it potentially could go towards support?
So I don't have those numbers. And frankly, because child welfare is not uniform, it is sometimes county run, sometimes state run, sometimes state administered, county run. So there's a whole bunch of different mix of funding streams. We don't have a single funding stream in child welfare. It's a mix of federal, state, and county funding and different authority bases regionally, locally, and statewide. And so I don't know overall what that mix is. What I do know just by experience is it is nowhere near even close to even, because prevention, frankly, is a lot less expensive. And we spend billions of dollars on maintaining the foster care industrial complex that is a mix of bricks and mortar and people's positionality that is reliant upon bringing kids into the system, right? I used to have a board member who said this, and I'll say it, just know that I have not been able to let it leave my head, but she used to say, every system needs to eat. Be careful what yours eats. And in order to keep this complex running, we need to continue to funnel children in. And so there is a lot of inertia around what we would call obsoleting the need to separate children from their families.
And is that where we want to go, right?
Yeah. I mean, I personally would love to obsolete the need to separate children from their families, or sometimes we say create the community conditions for children and families to live safely together. That doesn't mean that right now every child and family should stay together, right? That means that do we have the kinds of supports in place that wouldn't bring us to a place of needing to separate children and families, that when there was a crisis, we would just know about it so much earlier. Supports would exist. There'd be ways of supporting children and families, right? Because what we know is no matter what we do for kids, no matter what we do, it will never be what they really, really need, which is for their mom and dad to be okay and to be able to safely parent them. And so no service, no treatment, no placement would ever replace that, right? So our goal needs to be, how do we support families to stay safely together? And we know that's not the way it is right now, but we would hope that would be. And here's the other thing to say. Here's the difference in the future and the now, the future state and the current state. Now we rescue and remove children from their parents. We give parents an unreasonable list of things to do. When they don't do it, we say, aha, it proved our assumption that you can't safely parent these kids because you can't do this incredible list while you're also in crisis from having your child removed from you. And so a child inserts the system and has a really hard time returning. And we blame, shame, punish, and disconnect that parent. And in a future state, we would know that families are not the problem. They're actually the solution, and they are the foundation of lifelong well-being. And so we would do everything we could to preserve relational connections as sacred, which means our investments would be in parents to be able to safely parent, not rescuing, removing, and treating children. And so, I started my career as a child savior. I really did. I was going to save these kids. And the more I have learned and the longer I have worked, which is now 34 years at this, I have just become a real advocate of parents and believe that what children need is for their parents to be okay. And we literally invest almost nothing in that happening, even though we know developmentally and from the science and the research that is by far the most important thing. And so regardless of what you think about parents, you've got to find a way to get yourself to, if you care about kids, you must care about parents.
Yeah. There must be small but significant steps to get there.
Yeah, there are small and significant steps. I mean, one is really just our mindset around parents and the judgment we place there. Another is our mindset around the bias we have and our own internal work to work on bias against parents, bias against, persons and communities of color. Like that's all internal work that's got to be done. And those seem like small shifts, but they have major impacts when they're not in order. And so we often start by working with leaders and folks in systems to do that kind of introspection, to become more trusted partners with communities, to understand the harm that has been done, so that they're able to do the kind of, reconciliation that needs to happen to be able to move forward in some of these ways. Another mindset shift that I think is just vital to this is one toward healing and belonging and away from treatment and placement. That treatment and placement are not the solution. They actually re-traumatize children in irreparable ways. And so how do we connect them to people first and then services? Not just services are not going to, again, air quotes, cure these kids. It's connection and belonging that we all crave and need on a primal level. And when we have that, it changes things. And in a way that living with people unrelated and unknown to you cannot.
Yeah, it's the power of meaningful relationships. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, is there some work you can point to recently that can help us illustrate some of these things that you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, we are really doing some amazing work in Wisconsin with a group of 17 African-American mamas who call themselves the Beehive because they're all queens. And they are working to co-design new ways of work alongside systems leaders. So they have developed what they call an idea book, which is what they envision for the future state of their community. What might they need? How might it look to have the community conditions that help families stay safely together? So the idea book is available for download there, and we're doing some presentations at conferences around the country, but that work has really landed in a 73% reduction of the number of kids in foster care and a dramatic reduction, about a third of the kids who are living in institutions and residential. And right now, the work they're doing is in mutual accountability. And so it's not just to what are the families accountable to the system, but how is the system accountable to families? And so these mamas are working side by side with systems leaders to design a performance appraisal process. So the parents are saying, this is what matters to us and what we would wish you to be accountable to and to have performance appraisals measure. And so, there's a whole bunch of work on our website that is about the 14 county, 4-state innovation cohort we did and the amazing results there. And there's new work on Rock County. We've done a social return on investment study about the financial return on investment of placing kids with kin and supporting parents over separation. So there's a whole bunch of evidence for this way of work and examples of this way of work that's available on our website at Alia Innovations with an S, ALIA innovations.org. And all that's free for download. So you can take a look at some of that work there. And we call this kind of new way of work. We don't know what this new system will be called. Some people have called it Child and Family Wellbeing System or the Family First System or whatever, but we call it an unsystem because we really don't believe we're actually trying to build a new parallel system. We're trying to unsystem. We're trying to unravel the system closer to the people impacted to get them the resources, services in their community. It's really community building so that we don't have the same kind of need for systemic intervention.
Now, is there any kind of emerging research coming down the pike that gives us a little bit of an intersection point with this work where we can do something?
Absolutely. I think some of the most exciting emerging evidence is around cash supports that are being given to families. And when you think about how much we spend to uphold the system that is re-traumatizing folks versus just directly putting cash supports in the hands of folks, our friends at Casey and at Chapin Hall, and we're doing some experimenting here and many others. It's coming quite quickly, the evidence that says that child abuse and neglect is reduced when the stress of poverty is reduced. Giving unrestricted cash supports directly to parents reduces abuse and neglect. And so our friends in Washington County, Maryland, when they were in the innovation cohort, they started thinking about their transition by starting in economic supports because it was an early indicator of later child abuse and neglect. When families came in and, needed economic assistance, it would predict later trouble in the family. And so if they could intervene early, it would predict that. And that's exactly what the evidence and research is showing. And I know we've got some cultural hurdles to get over around giving cash assistance, but the evidence says that it would save us not only a ton of money, but it would also save a ton of trauma intergenerationally for up to 7 generations forward is what the research says. This is something we need to be paying really close attention to because they're clear, compelling, and very exciting results around a cash assistance model. We are ready to get to the next place to support families so that they can stay safely together. And we're understanding the importance of that happening. So I think it's a wonderful time to be doing child welfare. And I think the next decade is going to change everything.
Here in New Hampshire, we're working on trying to better understand that too with ROIs and investment and what we're calling the trestle funds from support from New Hampshire Charitable Foundation and just figuring out how we can lower that threshold and create support. So thank you for coming on.
It's my pleasure.
I do have, as part of the long goodbye, a quick question about being from Minnesota. Do you like pickled fish?
Well, I was born and raised outside Chicago, but I did not eat fish in Illinois or in Chicago, and certainly no pickled fish.
Okay, what about if you were to have a sausage? What condiments would go on that sausage?
Mustard and onion.
If you could change your Zoom to a garage, and then we'll say goodbye about 15 minutes there, you would be part of my family. Many thanks to the Samuel P. Hunt Foundation for sponsoring this podcast. Established in 1951, Samuel P. Hunt Foundation is a Manchester-based, independent nonprofit that provides grants primarily for the arts, children and youth services, faith-based organizations, educational institutions, healthcare, and human services. This podcast was brought to you by Nixon Peabody, who delivers exceptional legal services for clients in the community by combining high performance, an entrepreneurial spirit, deep engagement, and an unwavering commitment to a culture of collaboration, diversity, and humanity. Nixon Peabody works with universities, hospitals, and nonprofits of every size to maximize impact. For more information, visit nixonpeabody.com. Today's show was also brought to you by Merrimack County Savings Bank, who proudly supports the mission and efforts of New Hampshire Children's Trust. Founded in 1867, Merrimack has served people, businesses, nonprofits, and municipalities in central and southern New Hampshire for over 155 years by treating everyone with care, respect, and compassion. Visit your local offices in Bow, Concord, Kentucky, Hooksett, and Nashua, or go to www.themerrimack.com. New Hampshire Family Now is listed on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and more. Listen wherever you get your podcasts or ask your smart speaker to play New Hampshire Family Now.